Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion as part of the Unlocking the Economic Potential of LGBTQI plus people through Inclusive Development. It's a series that we're working on, and I'll have a little more to say about that. My name is Diego Garcia Bloom, and I am the director of the Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights Program at the Carr Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So this series is a collaboration between the Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights Program at the Carr Center, the Harvard Center for International Development, and the Institute for Business and Global Societies at the Business School, which we sometimes refer to as BIGS. And so, we know that LGBTQI plus people have historically been left out, facing discrimination, being pushed to the margins of society, and often denied access to the regular economy. In too many places, LGBTQI people can't safely express their identity, and violence is still a constant threat. That's exactly why the UN stepped in and created the LGBTQI Inclusion Index back in 2015. And the index was designed to be a global benchmark, helping countries and organizations track their progress towards ensuring full inclusion of LGBTQI people. The index also aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, making sure that LGBTQI rights are part of the global development agenda. And institutions like the ones here today, multilateral development banks, have been working with this index as a useful framework to shape policies and programs that advance LGBTQI inclusion in their work. So the index is a single number that summarizes 51 indicators of whether a country is inclusive of LGBTQI people. And these 51 indicators fall across 5 dimensions: economic well being, education, health, civic and political participation, and personal security and violence. So you can imagine all of the legal and economic analysis, and not to mention the data challenges that go into assessing each of these categories. And as I mentioned, today is part of a broader series of how this framework is being used. Uh, Today we'll focus on how multilateral development banks are using this framework and ideas, but also we will be looking at subsequent events on civil society organizations and UN groups. The third will be the role of academia and think tanks. And finally, the fourth will focus on the private sector. And so if you have not signed up yet for the rest of the series, you can do it through this link. That's not it. Sorry. I'll post it in a second for everybody to sign up. And so before we begin, I want to quickly go over some of the terms that come up often, because although a lot of the folks here have their own lingo and they throw around terms a lot, maybe some of you may not have heard these. So I'm going to actually share a PowerPoint real quick. So one of the terms you may hear today is SOGIESC. And this is a term that is actually kind of an alternative to LGBTI. And SO stands for sexual orientation, GIE, gender identity and expression, and SC, sex characteristics. And what's interesting about this term is it was born out of some experts coming together in Yogyakarta and thinking about a way of talking about the LGBTQI community that was able to capture more people. I could say that I identify as gay, someone is bisexual, but there's all different kinds of ways of identifying. But then when you frame it in this way, gay, bisexual, lesbian, pansexual, who knows what, all the different ways of people to identify is kind of captured in sexual orientation, right? And so similarly, gender identity and expression can capture a larger trans plus umbrella. And sex characteristics is very inclusive of intersex people. So it's a way now that advocates in the global movement have been talking about LGBTQI people in a way that it's a better catch-all than the acronym we use sometimes. And I say that as someone who has the acronym in their program name. But it's kind of a growing thing that we are incorporating. And then a few very small other things, but MDBs, multilateral development banks, just in case, CSOs, civil society organizations, SDG Sustainable Development Goals. And then I had this here just because it was important, but these are kind of like the 5 indexes of the UN Inclusion Index: economic well-being, political participation, education, health, and security. So, well, I want to say a few things. As we go, we'll have a first round with panelists. We'll speak about the challenges and trends in their regions, and we'll go one by one. And then the second, we'll do a deeper dive on the approaches that each institution is using. And as you go, please, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. Just drop your question there at any time. We'll pick them up at the end, and we might just ask you to directly ask it if you're willing, or we can read it. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. Clifton Cortez is the Global Advisor on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, SOGIE, at the World Bank, where he leads efforts to integrate SOGIE inclusion into global operations. Francesco Tornieri is a Principal Social Development Specialist in the Human and Social Development sector at the Asian Development Bank, and we're currently leading the finalization of ADB's roadmap for SOGIE inclusion. Samreen Shabazz is social development consultant with both the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, so she falls kind of in two of these, focusing on social inclusion and social safeguards for marginalized community. And I'll also say Samreen was the person that brought all of the panelists here today, so thank you so much for all the work that you did. And Dr. Maria Amelia Viteri is Senior Social Specialist at the Inter-American Bank, focusing on gender, diversity, and inclusion across Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you all for being here. And I guess we'll go into the first round of questions. And I'll start with the regional context and challenges. Now, the World Bank isn't in a region exactly, but we do have a question for you, Clifton. The World Bank has conducted some groundbreaking research on LGBTQI people's inclusion. Why is this data important for people and institutions working in development? And what are some of the key insights of the work?
Thank you for that, Diego. I'll start off by touching on a couple of things that you've raised. One is the acronyms. And I would say that, in fact, we should think of those as complementary and not alternatives. You know, the language we use in English, the LGBTQIA plus and various configurations of it, are really people-centered terms. And they're things that they're terms that people often use to self-identify. Whereas SOGIESC is really capturing the personal characteristics that can lead to discrimination, stigma, exclusion. And so the terms of what those personal that signify those personal characteristics are really important for us in development in terms of how we think about inclusive development. So we use both. We use the acronyms, and we use the acronyms that are self-identifying. In fact, we'll use whatever acronyms our counterparts across the table are using, civil society, governments, whatever it might be. But we find the personal characteristics acronym useful for our analysis and how we think about exclusion. The other thing I'd like to say is to touch on just the issue of human rights and inclusive development. They really are. We need to make sure that we're preaching as much as we can that these are not mutually exclusive things. And I can assure you, in the multilateral development banks for too long, many people have thought they are supposed to be mutually exclusive. And in fact, they're two sides of the same coin. The human rights and inclusive development are striving for the same goals, but often using different frameworks and to get to the same end goal, right? And so really the language we use, either the human rights language and frameworks or the development language and frameworks, it really depends on who we're talking to and who we're trying to convince. Now let's talk about this important research that you noted in the World Bank. We actually have two really flagships that we're trying to move. One is just testing out and rolling out more robust methodology for measuring the economic cost of exclusion based on SOGIESC. And we have 2 studies from Serbia and North Macedonia that were released last September. And we have a 3rd study underway now, has been initiated in Brazil. And we want to see more of these studies over time in more countries, because this is the data that we can bring to government counterparts, particularly, who may not have been up to now convinced by the human rights argument. We wish they would be, but maybe they aren't, or maybe it's not going to move them to change policies or even laws. But perhaps complementing that with things like economic cost and the benefits of inclusion will in terms of development, will get them there. And so that's the way we should think about this. The other flagship is what you've already noted, and that is the equality of opportunity for sexual and gender minorities. And we call our acronym for that, which is awkward, given is EQUISOGI, EQOCOGI, EQUISOGI. And what we've done here is we've taken a long-standing methodology of the World Bank in an initiative called Women, Business, and the Law. And what that does is it looks at laws and regulations that either promote women's engagement in economic growth or act as barriers to women's engagement. And it scores those laws, and then it ties them to other development indicator analysis, including economic growth analysis. And so we've taken that approach and we've applied it to SOGIESC. And we now have released a study. There was a 16-country study, a pilot, on just the legal indicator analysis, released in September of 2021. So we were just proving the approach for this, for SOGIESC. And ADB itself, Asian Development Bank, which they're going to, I think we'll probably be talking about, they also have a regional legal analysis based on our methodology that looks a lot like our, in terms of what it looks at, the 16-country original report of the World Bank. And then what we've released in September of this year, last month, is a 64-country study. It covers these 6 legal indicator sets that you can see. And we really did do analysis that also broke that down according to the 3 groupings: LGB, which is the sexual orientation, the T and beyond, which is gender identity as well as expression, and then sex characteristics in terms of intersex people. And really what we're trying to understand is what the impact of laws, positive laws or negative laws in this case, what that means for the most important development outcomes, or some of the most important development outcomes that our clients, the clients of the bank, of the governments, that they're focused on. And that is increasing wealth, building human capital, ensuring and strengthening voice and accountability. And those are certainly very important elements of sustainable development and inclusive development. And we think that this kind of research can help move us all along that path towards inclusive and sustainable development. So that's what EQUISOGI is, and we're happy when we get to questions later to give a little more detail and talk about what we've done there.
Thank you, Clifton. So now moving on to Samarine. The Asia Pacific region has seen tremendous progress in terms of addressing legal barriers to LGBTQI inclusion in recent years. But what are the persistent challenges and also the emerging opportunities in the region for enabling an environment that is LGBTQ inclusive in development?
Thank you, Diego. I'm just going to pull up my presentation very quickly and let me know if you're not able to see it. I have multiple files opened at my end.
We can see it, yeah.
All right. Okay, so I will, Cliff has mentioned the 2 recent studies that ADB and World Bank have conducted that look at legal inclusion of LGBTQI plus people. I will talk about findings from both of these studies that apply to Asia and Pacific region. Here's a very quick snapshot of legal status of LGBTQI plus people and their inclusion in Asia, 17 countries that were included in the ADB study. And we have color-coded these countries into 3 different categories. We have countries in green that have some degree of legal protections available for LGBTQI plus people. And then we have some countries coded in red that have criminalized people based on their SOGIESC. That includes Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, Kyrgyz Republic. And then there are some countries coded in orange that they do not criminalize SOGIESC, but they also do not have any protections embedded in their current legal and regulatory system. We'll do a bit of a deep dive into some of these countries. Let's look at all the countries that are coded green and what is the nature and scope of existing legal protections for LGBTQI people in those countries. We can broadly categorize them in three different types of protections. One is constitutional protections. There are some countries in the region that extend constitutional protections to LGBTI people. Fiji, for instance, has constitutional protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation. Then there are countries that have anti-discrimination provision in their sectoral laws and regulations. For instance, countries like Mongolia that have anti-discrimination provision in their labor code, and those provisions extend to LGBTI people. Then there are countries like Philippines and Thailand that have sectoral laws that extend protections in either education sector or access to public services. And then there are countries in the region that have comprehensive anti-discrimination laws that apply to multiple sectors and in various socioeconomic domains. However, those laws are often only aimed for extended protections to transgender people. I'm talking about countries like India and Pakistan and Thailand that have enacted laws that provide comprehensive, broad protections to transgender people across various socioeconomic domains. There are some emerging trends that we are seeing in recent years in terms of inclusion of LGBTQI plus people in the region. Some countries in the region are now including these groups in gender equality laws and policies. Sri Lanka is a very interesting example here because Sri Lanka at the same time is also considering decriminalization of same-sex relations. And Bhutan and Sri Lanka are currently considering amendments in their laws and policies on gender equality to make them more inclusive of SOGIESC. There are countries that do not have any legal and regulatory protections in their current frameworks, but they have included LGBTQI people in their national action plans, their strategic plans. Cambodia stands out as an example here. So Cambodia's National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence extends protections to LGBT women as well. We are also noticing an increasing recognition of same-sex unions in the region. Thailand is a champion, as we all know. Thailand has recently passed the marriage equality bill, and it has been approved by the king as well. We have Nepal as well, that Nepal's Supreme Court last year issued a ruling and ordered the government to establish a mechanism to start registering same-sex unions. And then we have countries like South Korea and Japan where public interest litigation is being used as a tool to ask to extend benefits that are available for heterosexual couples and extend those benefits to same-sex couples as well. And the outcome of those public interest litigation has been so far positive in most cases. So these are some of the recent emerging trends in terms of inclusion of LGBTQI people in the region. And I will very quickly show the two studies that we have briefly mentioned here. And I'll paste the links of both studies in the chat box as well as for people who are interested in having a more deeper look at the legal status of SOGIESC inclusion in the region. And I'll stop here. Back to you, Diego.
Thank you, Samreen. So I'll move on now to Dr. Maria Amelia. So the Latin American region, and to some extent the Caribbean region, has been championing the movement for legal and regulatory protections for LGBTQI people. How have these gains translated into meaningful participation and inclusion of LGBTQI people in development and in the economies of the region?
Thank you, Diego, again. It's wonderful to be here. And I will start mentioning how development policies, one of the gains is that development policies have begun to explicitly include LGBTIQ plus considerations, as Cliff and Samreen mentioned, around the world. Now, in Latin America, first, I will say we need to consider that Latin America and the Caribbean is a region of great diversity, and this diversity encompasses, as we know, different attitudes, behaviors, and the recognition, in some cases, of the rights of individuals with sexual and gender diversity. So we start with one of the first steps, which is preventing discrimination, is to understand and identify what are some of these risks. And here we will go into thinking about that any analysis of what could be inclusive development starts with what are some of the potential risks of, for example, a project for LGBTQI plus communities, and what are the specificities of the local context. So if we are thinking about the policy that I will talk about shortly after, the Caribbean and Central America, Southern Cone, or Andean countries are not going to be necessarily the same. What we do know is the same, is that without including LGBTQI plus individuals, it's not possible to reduce poverty and promote shared prosperity. So, for example, in cases where we see criminalization of sexual orientation and or gender identity, that we know that can hinder both productivity, inclusion, economic growth. Now, global discussions surrounding the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, specifically recognize the principle of leaving no one behind. And these, specifically in Latin America, translates that development reaches the most marginalized individuals. So our new institutional strategy acknowledges these links among three dimensions of sustainable development that have to do precisely with your question. That's economic, social, and environmental. Through, for example, community development initiatives. Another approach that we have taken that goes hand in hand with community development initiatives is making visible the need of LGBTIQ plus communities to access health, education, labor, water, and sanitation. Now, in order to do this, we have started to develop baselines during the design of our operations. These baselines specifically focus on the needs of LGBTI plus communities, help us to, for example, understand current conditions, like what are quantified discrimination and violence? What are the barriers to access? Something as that might seem as simple as how can LGBTQI plus communities not only be part of, for example, accesses to services like water and sanitation, but also what we have found out in different research studies is that they're usually not considered as clients. So if they are not considered as part of the services that they have the rights to, and they are not considered as clients, then they are excluded in two ways. And so barriers to inclusion, I will say that have been something that has been extremely important to kind of highlight through the incredible new policies, legal advancements, like with equal marriage in the region. A challenge has been to how do these legal policies and recognitions lend into, in our case, specifically operations. And for that, as I mentioned, we have been working on different approaches. And I will say one of the most important will be community development and understanding risks in order to make sure that communities, LGBTQI plus communities, are part of an inclusive and thriving development in Latin America.
Thank you so much. So this concludes the first part of going through the regions. I just want to reflect on some takeaways, because as actually we've been, if you ever in one of our classrooms, takeaways is one of the most important things you do. And when you actually prompt people to do some takeaways, they internalize a lot of the learning faster than if you don't. So, one of the things that I took note of that just really resonated with me first was Clifton's note that human rights and development go together. But you may not have thought about it that way, right? You may not have thought that the World Bank, that the ADB, the Inter-American Bank, have been working on core human rights issues like protection to discrimination, having access to the resources that allow you to have a life in the full economy. But they are, and not only that, they have taken such a an analytical lens to it, not only analyzing the laws, but what it means in the economy, that it's going so far in promoting the human rights of LGBTQI people. At the same time, the human rights lens and approach isn't the most useful everywhere. In their countries where you come in with the words human rights and they'll stop you. But if you go in with the words development, economic inclusion, economic growth, then that could be an opening. And so we have seen some movement like that in the Middle East as well. We actually have a project with Saudi Arabia right now that is interested in opening up more tourism, opening up, getting the World Cup perhaps, and that economic kind of way of talking about things has actually opened up conversations that have not been possible before. And so I want you all to kind of think about that. These aren't two different things. And then what Samreen and Clifton mentioned about the cost of exclusion. If you can tell a country you're losing this much percentage of your GDP because you discriminate, because you're excluding all of these people out of your economy, and because they want to leave, but they're very smart people and they end up contributing to another country, that's a really good argument. And also just seeing Maria Amelia's talk about, they're also identifying the barriers to like the de facto implementation of these laws, which is a really hard analysis, but they're doing it. So thank you so much. Does anyone want to comment on any of the takeaways or? All right. And please, as I mentioned, put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them. So now we've gone into some of the regional ways or trends in how some regions of the world are doing. Sadly, Heinrich, who was with the European Reconstruction and Development Bank, got stuck in a really terrible flight and travel situation, so we weren't able to hear from him. But we'll move on. So how is your institution approaching the work, the actual work? And what are some of the key actions that you have taken implementing the work? And we can start with Francesco, who Samreen kind of touched on some of the ADB, and now Francesco's gonna take the ADB side now.
Francesco, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought that was automatically done. So good evening, everyone. I was saying, as panelists, we work together, we know each other well. So I cannot but iterate the economic versus human rights argument that was already raised by both Cliff and Maria Amelia, as having been a very important element upon which we built the ongoing efforts toward the finalization of a roadmap. It is true that we all know that economic rights are underpinned by human rights, but it simply doesn't make it very far when you take a human rights approach. So I think in the few minutes that we're going to spend together from an ADB perspective, I think the objective of sharing with you the roadmap has been a commitment at management level, but also in response to the board requests to basically introduce an operational approach to it. An operational, roadmap which basically identify modality through which we can address SOGIESC inclusion in country partnership strategies, program, project. So the first thing that I thought could be interesting for the audience is going to be very short, but deep, and perhaps even, disturbing for you to understand how this organization works. So the very heart of this circle, there is the operating manual, which dictates how operations should ideally, conduct its operation. There is nothing that has precluded historically us to do SOGIESC inclusion. I want to be very clear. But today, for a combination of exogenous and endogenous factors, we're doing SOGIESC inclusion. So the question is, why couldn't we do it before? Related to that, the strategy is to incorporate SOGIESC inclusion within the country partnership strategy, which is the contract of the bank with its member countries. You can see on the green side, the poverty and social analysis, which is compulsory, and which basically dictates modality through which we design the project, the environmental and social framework, which is modality through which safeguards, environmental and social safeguards, are applied to each of the project. And interestingly, I mean, we are in the progress of approve them. We also have an overarching strategy 2030, which has finally identified, as you can see on the screen, the recognition of gender, equality, and social inclusion as a key determinants of exclusion and vulnerability. By the same token, we do have in the corporate results framework, we have a new indicator on poverty and inclusion, and the reference is explicitly made to SOGIESC. And last but not least, we basically, in the safeguards, perhaps an outcome that doesn't satisfy civil society, but there's a strong recognition of SOGIESC within the broader spectrum of discrimination and vulnerability. So to simply underpin what is the underpinning of a roadmap, I just wanted to basically emphasize what the roadmap is all about. I think it's providing an entry point for operational support. The goal is really, and I'd like to emphasize that along the lines of the economic rights comes economic opportunities. Hence, at the very center of the slides, the bottom line is promoting equitable or equitable access and inclusion of sexual and gender minority and accessibility to services. And I think this proposition has been quite powerful in the sense that, as I will explain a bit later, not even in countries that are rather conservative religiously or socioculturally, as soon as you ask, would you like your citizen to have an ID? Would you like your citizen to access equitably basic sexual, reproductive, and mental health services? The answer, even from the most conservative interlocutor, is by any possible means, yes. As citizen, they're entitled to it. So it's an interesting entry point that I thought. Those are the details of what a roadmap can look like, phase 1, phase 2. The phase 1 obviously determines the need to go deeper in ensuring that it is a shared responsibility. I think, again, I'm just a person who's been assigned as a team leader, but I think that the wealth of potential which derives from banks like ours is that you got broader sectors, you got the economic research department, which with statistics unit responsible for evidence-based policy, dialogue, and operational support. So they do have an interest to collect data, but there's an impact evaluation department who wants to assess the impact of what we do. There is a legal department whose job should be to promote gender or GESI responsive, gender equality, social inclusive responsive law. So if you start basically pulling the triggers and making sure that the SOGIESC inclusion is a shared responsibility, unfortunately, the outcome is very powerful. And I say unfortunately, because one of the things I have experienced is the fact that within the broader spectrum of exclusion and vulnerability, there is a sense in the fragmentation of the community of cohesive approach. And it's the cohesiveness of the SOGIESC agenda, as imperfect and as, again, changeling every day. There is something about it that make it a cohesive proposition, and that goes to the heart, just because of the use of the verb, of the sexual word or the sex. It goes really to the heart of the conscience, and that's a part that makes it more difficult to bring it forward. So anyway, on the right side of the screen is basically the 6 elements that will characterize the guidance notes, which is at the very heart of the roadmap. And there's nothing more than what I already said: data collection, supporting legal and policy reform, facilitating access to services, fostering economic and financial inclusion. I mean, we've been doing some work in complement of what Cliff, Samreen were naming about economic rights and legal rights. We do some work on financial inclusion. And it's a very interesting, the outcome of the financial inclusion work in terms of the bankability of this segment, of this untapped segment of the population. And then developing stakeholder awareness. As you can see in a second, sorry, no, I canceled it. But anyway, what I was trying to say is that the credibility of the roadmap lies in the context of Asia Pacific, in building alliances with the regional networks, APCOM, the International Lesbian and Gay Association, the Intersex Association, the Intersex Asia organization, and then the Association of the Transgender Networks based in Bangkok. Those 4 networks have provided the critical review of the roadmap and are the underpinning the credibility of it. To conclude, almost to say, how do you roll out a roadmap? I think Cliff and Anna Brixey, the Global Director of Gender, gave me this word of jump starting. So in a certain way, what I have done, thanks to the, you can see there's a concentration of green in the center of the screen. We do have demand by the clients, and clients are government. And I know that against all odds, that's an important statement to be made. Governments across Asia Pacific are demanding ADB support in the area of SOGIESC inclusion. There is no ideology behind it. It's ingrown, and it's really reflective of national values and aspirations of the community of the Asia Pacific. So what I wanted to show you is India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. We were able to mobilize. I'll show very quickly. For the other countries circled in red, the strategy will be to do some stock-taking exercises in Pakistan, in the GMS, Greater Mekong, sub-region Philippines, Timor, and the broader Pacific Islands, to identify entry points for pipeline building. With that, this is and I apologize to the other colleagues from the Development Bank. They see me showing these slides time and time again, but it is a little bit of the jewel in my little crown. Forgive me for the analogy. That's the only one that came up to me right now. But to say that mobilizing $2 million for transgender in Bangladesh has been a great source of commitment in my side, but also a great source of pride. Bhutan integrated approach. As you can see, sometimes in smaller contexts, better to take an integrated approach, old age, disability, and SOGIESC, and the intersectionality therein. It can go actually quite far to ally ourselves, particularly the disability movement. In Nepal, I'm crossing all the fingers I got, because with USAID, we're doing a potentially major data collection efforts. And also $3 million will be mobilized to work with civil society. And in India, working with India Council of Medical Research on transgender operating procedure and awareness campaign in Sri Lanka. Solo to say that adopting grants NTA is not a practice that should be applied to all the countries, but it has definitely helped us creating a critical mass of entry points to then be basically expanding. And last but not least, actually, what I wanted to say is that I hope the spirits of this conversation today, and we discussed with Cliff and others, we do need some connection to the academics. So I hope that parts of the audience understands that we are here also, really personally I am, to engage with the academic organizations and to ensure that if you do have a research soul, if you do have a commitment to legal reform or to economic rights, please, reach out to us, because by only strengthening the networks in the US and beyond, we can definitely create a critical mass of efforts and credibility that can bring this agenda forward and not backward. So thank you very much. I'm sure I exceeded my minutes. Over to you, Diego.
That's all right. Since we also don't have Heinrich, we actually will have a lot of extra time today than we thought. But I also want to just say I see a lot of our Masters in International Development students here. As you all know, you need a thesis, a second-year policy analysis, that you need to partner with someone. And so, think of these folks too as great partners of that work, and I can facilitate that if you want. And the second-year policy analysis is basically a thesis, but it's a project that the student basically takes, sits down with an entity, could be one of you, and puts a research project out that you work together over the year. So that could be a great way to connect with students. So, the next question was for Heinrich, but actually I was wondering, Clifton, and sorry to throw this off the run, but would you want to say something about some of the implementation of the work of the World Bank as well, since we have a spot here?
So I'm actually going to get, I'll cover the overarching part of that when I get to the next question that I know you're going to throw at me. But on implementation, what I'll say is that, the banks work based on client demand. Again, remember, the clients are our clients are the governments, middle income and low income governments around the world. So we can do certain things because we're knowledge banks, not just financial banks. We can do certain things in analytics, like the global analytics I talked about before, equality of opportunity for sexual and gender minorities. But when it comes to what we're doing in operations, the actual loans that the governments are taking from us, let's take an example of an education loan. A Ministry of Education in a specific government gets a loan from the World Bank, hundreds of millions of dollars over 5 years, to improve their education system. And there'll be very specific things they're asking for in that loan. And there'll be milestones for whether we'll be able to measure what's being achieved through the use of this money that's coming in from the loan. And we can only engage, we can give good advice, right, on what inclusion means, what equality means, what non-discrimination requires. But going beyond non-discrimination, which is a requirement, we can only help them put in place through an operation what the client wants. Because at the end of the day, the resources are the government's, the taxpayers of the country, because they're going to pay it back to the World Bank or to the ADB, for example. And so we do see opportunities. There are lots of hard countries around the world, but we see opportunities in every region. And we've got clients asking for support on this. The really important thing to understand is that most of the time, in most governments and in the ministries that we work with, they don't have lots of in-depth knowledge of LGBTI people, and very often have never even engaged with LGBTI civil society organizations or academics in their own country. And so they come to when they see this as something that should be on their agenda, they're basically asking the development banks to help them with this, to help them in this, what is a new area for them, to help them define what this is in their own work in a ministry like health or education or on social protection programming or growing jobs or whatever it might be. And so we need to be fit for purpose for that. And what you heard Francesco talk about in his roadmap is really helping ADB to get to the place where they're fit for purpose, to respond to that need, that felt need of those governments. And that's exactly how we approach it in terms of the World Bank as well. I'll give one example then finally on an actual operation. So we had an operation in a South American country, and I'm not going to name it because the government changed. And so the new government may not want me to use them as an example. But we had an example of a country in South America in which the government asked for a loan or got a loan from the World Bank, hundreds of millions of dollars for urban development, urban redevelopment. And a big component of it was building housing for the poor in the urban areas where the loan was going to be implemented. And the client decided on its own that it wanted this to be a gender equality focused goal within this project. We call them projects when the governments take the loans in this way and get knowledge from the bank as well. And so they decided at the highest level of measuring success of this project, the loan, they were going to measure the number of housing units in the redevelopment, in the housing for the poor, that were allotted to women-headed households and LGBTI plus headed households. The government decided that that's how they were going to measure the success of the loan, why they were taking all this money from the World Bank. It'll take some time to see more and more of those high-level requests from governments for what gets included, but that's great, and that's exactly the kind of thing that can happen. And we're talking about tons of money. This goes beyond what most donors are bringing when they have projects in a country. So if we can impact that for queer people, this is going to be meaningful, right? It has big ripple effects in societies in terms of the programs that get funded by these bank loans.
Thank you for that example. And I'll say, even just the fact that, just like Francesco mentioned, putting compulsory analyses in this, making sure that governments are having data to track that, right? To see if they measured, that's a huge win in itself that something's overlooked, but that's super important. Okay, sorry. Now, Dr. Maria Amelia, now moving on to you. So what are some of the ways that the IDB is doing this work in including LGBTQ people in development?
Thank you so much, Diego. My Wi-Fi is not ideal, so I'm going to try to share my screen, and if it doesn't work, Samrina, I might ask for your help if that's okay. I have a few slides, just graphics of what I will be talking about. One second. Okay. It is not working, so it is frozen when I do the click on sharing. You cannot see it, right?
We see it now.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. Thank you.
So Maria Amelia, I'm sharing it from my end. Please let me know when I should move to
Okay,
next slide.
that's right.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Latin America and the Caribbean, as we know, have among the highest rates of violence and murders based on gender identity and sexual orientation. And often the relationship between access to services, well-being, and discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation remains invisible. The exclusion of the LGBTQI plus community and those perceived as such as well is largely a development issue due to its impact on the lives and poverty levels of entire groups, as well as adverse economic effects on economies and societies overall, as Cliff and Samreen and Francesco were noticing, as well as Diego. We can move to the next slide. So understanding how discrimination occurs and how it can be transformed strengthens efforts towards gender equality. There are various manifestations of discrimination, as we all know, in different areas, for example, social, labor, political life. And here I have to say that although we already had an operational policy as the Inter-American Development Bank that was called OP 761, the current ESPS 9, now we'll go through, I will go hand in hand on the terms, strengthens the obligations of the borrowing country and the contractors. So, for example, ensuring the continuation of our current gender policy, this environmental and social policy framework, which is what we call ESPF, has a dedicated standalone standard on gender equality with provisions for people of all genders. And our new framework explicitly addresses the risks of sexual and gender-based violence, exploitation, discrimination, and abuse in projects we support. We recognize that women and people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities need to be empowered in order to achieve equality. We can move to the next slide. To support and guide the design and implementation of development projects, as the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit, ESG, we have developed a guide to support the design and implementation of measures for the prevention and addressing of discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation. This is a pioneering guide that I have shared with my colleagues. Now it's currently in Spanish. It will soon be available in English. And what it does is provides some of the initial best practices and guidelines for tackling the intersections of discrimination and prejudice related to sexual orientation and gender identity, while also strengthening environmental and social sustainability in development projects. This guide is part of the resources, and this is part of what we are doing, and fully supporting the implementation of this policy framework. Particularly, we have 10 standards, and we can move to the next, thanks, Maureen. Particularly the Gender Equality and Social Performance Standard, and that is the 9th of 10 standards we have. This gender performance standard, in its broad definition, addresses the impacts that disproportionately affect both, again, as I mentioned, LGBTQI plus individuals as a direct result of operations. It encompasses gender in all its plurality, diversity, making visible and including individuals from diverse sexual and gender identities as a vulnerable group to sexual violence and various forms of gender-based violence and discrimination. This has required, and as I mentioned earlier, an analysis of risks and potential negative impacts, and it also mandates the adoption of necessary measures to avoid, minimize, mitigate, and compensate for these impacts within the context of projects financed by the IDB. This guide serves as a resource for incorporating a broad and inclusive perspective on gender equity, one that includes, again, sexual orientation and gender identity. We can move to the next summary. Thanks. The recommendations and practices outlined here are useful resources to consider in two fundamental instances. One, in the risk analysis of potential disproportionate negative impacts, and this word is key, disproportionate negative impacts that may arise from the operations of IDB-funded projects in the design of necessary prevention, mitigation, and compensation measures. Now, why is SOGIE and why is it important? Cliff and Diego mentioned at the beginning something about the terms, right? The acronym from the English, sexual orientation and gender identity refers to sexual orientation and gender identity. And the guide also includes definitions that are commonly used by international organizations and other global actors. And then, as Cliff was saying, at the end of the day, although we might use different acronyms, the most important thing is that we are tackling inequality, and we are seeking well-being of our societies, starting with LGBTQI+ communities. We can go to the next slide. Now, what can we do at a project level? And there was something that Diego was asking before. So here's in a nutshell, the social component of the social environmental assessment, for example, in one of the Caribbean countries of the water and sanitation project was carried out. So we did a data collection that was conducted using a qualitative research paradigm. These included semi-structured interviews with confidential measures, community organizations, non-governmental organizations, and residents. And among the resident population in this Caribbean country, individuals and various gender identities and were interviewed in all the 3 cities in this country. And what we learned is what I mentioned earlier. These communities were not only being excluded from services of water and sanitation, but they were not considered as clients. So, for example, one of the testimonies said that when a non-binary person that we work with will go to try to pay the water bill, they will have to wait sometimes the entire day in order to be able to do so. So because of their gender presentation, they were not even able to pay for the services. And this initiated a series of awareness work with our executing agency on why is it important, what are some of the, again, the definitions, the terms, human rights behind LGBTI+ communities, and specific steps with a budget on what can be done so that these communities not only have access to the services, but are not excluded and discriminated in order to access those services as well. So 2 things in one problem. Other actions that have been undertaken, and we work from the design of the project to the supervision. Since our policy is 2 years and a little bit more new, we're still, we will have some lessons learned from our implementation phase shortly that we will be more than happy to share with our fantastic group here and with everyone that is listening to us. So other things that can be done, design a survey, train interviewers that we have done as part of the project, and we are doing, train interviewers on what's the importance and how do you conduct surveys based on sexual and gender identity as a focus, ensuring that interactions are free of stigma and stereotypes, for example, because as we mentioned, usually people are unaware or what are the historical inequalities and stereotypes and ideologies that make people think stereotypically about LGBTQI+ communities. Develop strong social environmental assessments that include this aspect, consult LGBTQ+ and organizations and allies if there are no organizations, although I have found in Latin America there's always an organization, extremely active and working closely with communities and government as well. Integrate prevention measures, implement training and institutional strengthening. And we can go to the next slide, and I am mindful of the time. And so, in the slide that you see on the screen, you can see what are all the intersectionality that I'm talking about. So I'm going to close by saying that discrimination is often unintentional. That's something that I, me as a social scientist working on these issues for decades, have realized. So when we recognize that the negative impacts faced by LGBTQ+ individuals in their daily and professional lives is often a result of normative, operational, and I will say also social inertia that fails to account for the needs of LGBTQI+ community, this leads to sometimes inadvertent discrimination or exclusion. I'm not saying that And I'm talking about Latin America, right? Specifically. Discrimination is a learned behavior. No one is born discriminatory, for example. The forms of discrimination are based on artificial ideas and categories that society has labeled as acceptable or quotation marks normal, according to, as I mentioned, constructed ideological and cultural parameters. And these parameters become accepted truths, unfortunately, reiterated by social institutions responsible for education and government, such as families, the media, government, schools, and social networks, and so forth. So adopting measures to promote the inclusion of all individuals in IDB projects will has not only been ensuring the protection, respect, and fulfillment of everyone's rights, but is also providing benefits to societies, countries, and regions as a whole. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I had forgotten, but I'll put it now. This is the link to sign up for the other series that we're doing with civil society, with academia in the private sector. So if you want to sign up for those, there's the link. And so then I'll move on finally back to Clifton. I'm sorry to have jumped the gun there a little bit, Clifton, but so the question for you is a little more on how the World Bank approaches this work, but also how the World Bank is collaborating with the other regional NDBs to join forces and to promote the agenda.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You didn't jump the gun. We just got we got into a little more detail that might be actually helpful for the people who are listening in. So thanks for that. I'm going to very briefly want to talk now about the World Bank's agenda and how we approach this. And for us, very importantly, we think about this as being important for addressing gender equality. I'll say something a little bit about that. We see it as important for addressing social inclusion. And that means for us as the bank, that's defining an approach that includes inclusion based on race, based on ethnicity, based on having a disability or not, based on age, the elderly or youth, and of course, based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. So all of these, none of these are a flavor of the month. The idea is that they all feed into an inclusion approach. And then finally, we also grounded in non-discrimination. And you heard Amelia talking a bit about that in terms of their own programming for the Inter-American Development Bank. But we all have an authorizing environment. So anything we do has to be able to hang under that authorizing environment as public institutions. We have executive boards that make the policy of the banks. These are the governments themselves. They're the shareholders and those that do borrowing from the bank. They are the board. These are working boards. They meet in and out day by day. They decide on the loans that are being approved, et cetera. And they make the policies of our banks. And so all of us, though, are supposed to be supporting each government's adopted framework. And for now, we all know that those are the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN promulgated. The UN, and that means the UN, all the member states. We're supposed to be supporting that. And we do that through our own work. We have our own vision that helps us do that. For the bank, it's about ending extreme poverty on a livable planet. So covering both the people side of things as well as the environment or planet side of things, if you will. And we have policy that comes from our board that we call safeguards. All of our banks have these, or in the case of the bank, the World Bank, our newest ones from a few years ago are called the Environmental and Social Framework. And what those safeguards are about is ensuring that resources from the banks that clients don't take those resources and do anything that can harm the environment or harm people, the environmental and the social. And so we have things that have to be done, implemented, and measured in every operation to ensure they're abiding by these policies for the bank. Again, the Environmental and Social Framework, ESF, we call it. There is a special focus within the ESF on the social side for disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, people in groups, individuals in groups. And we have a World Bank directive to staff, helping them understand what this term of art means, disadvantaged or vulnerable individuals or groups. And it lists personal characteristics that can lead to discrimination in a project or exclusion from the benefits of a project. And it names sexual orientation and gender identity among a number of others. And then the most recent addition to our authorizing environment, or how we're able to approach this in a legitimate way, if you will, is the new World Bank gender strategy that takes us up to 2030 now. And it is the first strategy of a multilateral development bank that defines gender as going beyond the binary. So the very first footnote in our gender strategy on page 1 gives the definition of gender for the purposes of the strategy, and it includes or encompasses the concepts of gender identity and gender diversity. And beyond gender identity and gender diversity, woven throughout are the issues that need to be included relative to sexual and gender minorities. So not just gender minorities, but also sexual minorities, because in our analysis, we determined that the bases for LGBTIQ plus exclusion and discrimination is grounded in traditional, some would say, ossified ideas of gender and gender roles and gender expectations. These ideas that too often penalize women and girls, and also are the basis of what acts as a barrier for sexual and gender minorities. And so we've tried to encompass all that in our new gender strategy. And this is really important because the gender equality is something our clients finally, maybe not in the early years, but at this point, they all are on board with the idea, at least, that they're supposed to be striving for gender equality. And although we're not all the way there yet, including in laws, we're moving in that direction. And so we can then build on the partnerships for gender equality to help also move the equality for sexual and gender minorities. I think we can go on from there, and I'm going to talk about our pillars of work, really. We define these pillars of work as, you heard me say, our clients are the governments, the demands of the clients. So it's about responding to their needs, and our public institutions needing to be fit for purpose to be able to respond to those needs. Some of you may have heard about, or you are aware of, the fact that some of the clients of our banks are not on board with this development agenda, or as a development agenda, who are not willing or able to engage on SOGIESC and inclusion, or SOGIESC inclusion specifically. They have obligations on non-discrimination nonetheless, and that comes under the second pillar of work. That is the environmental and social framework. The safeguards is the more generic term that all our banks use. And those are those legal obligations that come with every loan. It's in the legal documents about what they can and they must do, or what they cannot do with these resources, including allowing discrimination in any programs that enjoy bank financing. And that includes discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, for example. And then, very importantly, we have set up for ourselves, we believe the bank should be a leader with others in generating data and knowledge to bridge the evidence gap that we have when it comes to development and outcomes and sexual and gender minorities. Almost no government, not many governments, generate LGBTI plus specific data. We know that. And that's a big reason for the big data gap. Now, lots of CSOs do, and increasingly academics, but the governments often can find reasons to ignore that kind of data. When it comes from a development partner like the banks, it's harder for them to ignore that. And so it's really important that we're a part of generating data that is SOGIESC specific, and that we bring that to the table in our loan negotiations with governments to try to ensure that they have these things on their radar, and that the potential for how we include that in various activities under operations, under a bank financed project. So think about, again, to concretize it, remember that example I gave you of the housing and measuring that by the number of LGBTIQ households that benefit from the housing project. And we could talk about other examples too. I know we'll have a little time to chat. And then finally, it's a given that we have some clients that are very challenging for all of us and for the banks on these issues. And in those cases, we have internal protocols for how we address our country offices, which are the first line of engagement with our clients, how we address these specific challenges. It's not easy. It's new for the banks, and so we don't have all the answers yet. Some of you may be familiar with a country in Africa in which there's an ongoing engagement between the World Bank and one of our clients, specifically because of these issues, and a new law, atrocious law, that was passed last year. And it's a discriminatory law in every way, shape, and form. And not only discriminatory, but it's at least discriminatory. And therefore, our environmental and social framework kicks in. And that's the response you've seen by the bank so far is grounded in that policy that comes from our board on non-discrimination. So this kind of at a 30,000 foot or meter high level gives you a sense of how we think about our work and how we categorize that and the kinds of things we're trying to move. And I'm happy to talk about any of this. So back over to you, Diego.
Thank you so much, Clifton. I'm actually very pleased. There's a couple already of the MPA ID, the development students who have messaged me to get connected with you all. So I know, so please keep messaging me, and I'm happy to make that connection. And I want to highlight just some of the things that we heard, because one, a lot of the refrains we use are, if it's not counted, right, it's not acted upon. And these compulsory analyses that are being built in for countries to be able to get these loans are building, for the first time in many cases, the first ways that LGBTQ people are being counted in the economy, in society, and usually, or not usually, but maybe mostly, by the actors least wanting to do this counting. And so being able to get that data is very important. And second, the case that Clifton, and I don't want to put you in a tricky position, so I won't go into the details, but this very terrible law was signed in one of the African countries. One of the ministers comes out and says almost $4 billion could be a stake in credit if it's passed. And then the president holds off from signing it, citing those pressures, right? So this has real implications. And so this isn't only just a world to be interested in from the sense of a development officer or someone working in development, but someone from advocacy, because these banks are putting real teeth into a lot of the work that they are including when they make these contracts with the partner governments. So I want to thank you all for being here. Let's start with some questions. And I guess the first one here is from Max Again. So Max, do you want to answer this? Do you want to ask this live or? I'll read it out loud, and then I think there's someone else. If you have raise your hand and would be able to, if you want to speak and ask a question. But we'll ask this one. What's the theory of change here in how you incorporate, quote unquote, broader definitions to fuel change or inclusion? Yeah, and so I think, Francesco, you added in your circles that you were incorporating in discrimination, you were adding SOGI identities. So what, maybe very quickly, what do you hope to achieve with that?
But listen, as Cliff pointed out, and you can see, for instance, the title on my roadmap is not LGBTQI plus, is sexual and gender minority. What I'm trying to add is the fact that the broader, we adapt, as Cliff pointed out, to the social cultural context of the countries in which we are. So what's the objective of having a broader definition is basically to engage more, even in situations like in my engagement in a country in South Asia, on the upper right side of South Asia, where clearly, there is a problem with definition between transgender and hijra, which is a traditional context, in South Asia. The issue is that personally, I'm very inclined to compromise on the use of words, take a broader approach, as I have done, to say, look, there is disability, there is old age, there is sexual orientation, gender identity, there is also caste and ethnicity. How can we help you? And most of the time, of course, the eyes goes into, let's talk about disability as a sort of, and then I like, but disability is not isolated, there are intersectional dimensions such as old age. And then it goes like sexual orientation, or maybe you forget the sexual orientation word and you talk about gender identity. My experience suggests that nobody has an issue with gender identity, including any other social, cultural, and religious backgrounds that I've been dealing with. Gender identity is something unquestioned. It's the word orientation that is always creating a little bit of a bump in the process. So to me, the broader, the better to engage.
Clifton, you want to add to that?
Sure, and it's really about the issue of conceptual frameworks and theories of change. Not exactly what Max was asking of Francesco, I think, but it's related. And that, our conceptual framework is that we want the banks to think about, and we want the governments in their projects to think about what is happening at the individual level. And at the individual level, what folks are experiencing is stigma, discrimination, too often violence when they're sexual and gender minorities, and because they're sexual and gender minorities. And that individual level experience is what then appears at the community level, and exclusion from programs, from services. You're turned away from social protection, even though you otherwise qualify. You're not allowed to stay in school because of severe bullying and violence. Or you stay and you don't learn as well because of the horrible atmosphere. You don't get the best or the right health services and health service delivery. That's community level exclusion. That's growing up from that individual level experience of stigma and discrimination and violence. And we believe, as the banks, that as we generate more data with partners, including civil society, we'll be able to fill in the dotted line between the individual level experience, the community level exclusion, and things that our clients tell us they care about, like impacts on their GDP or on the Human Development Index, the way the UN measures these things. And that's where we get the attention at the high policy level for change. It doesn't happen quickly enough. It won't happen in all places in the same way and at the same time, but that's what we're pushing for. And you could take out SOGIESC or LGBTI plus from that individual level experience and stick in anything else, any other personal characteristic. It is exactly the same conceptual framework.
Great. So Rachna, Emma, can you help me bring Rachna in to ask the question?
Yep, they should be able to talk now.
Great. Go ahead, Rachna.
Hi, so hi, I'm coming in from USAID, India, and I work on inclusive development. I'm very intrigued because we are also on the panel of MDB proposals which come into India and the region for review. I just was very interested to know, like, what has been your experience of, have you worked in the region with LGBTQ women? Because in India, there's a lot of acceptance and rights for transgenders as compared to LGBTQ women, and we do have a policy, LGBTQI plus policy, and also talking about, collaboration with World Bank on a variety of things. But I did not know that World Bank is working so actively on LGBTQI plus inclusion till now. And I would be really grateful for some more information on that, offline or otherwise, about the work you do in India and the surrounding countries. Thank you so much.
Clifton, I guess we'll make sure to send your work out there and connect with Rachna on India. Or does anyone want to take a shot at some work they may be doing in India? Francesco?
Yeah, I can do that. Well, I think Rachnaji, I cannot but agree more, and I pause a bit. Yes, it is not an easy subject to adopt. The letter T has been among the long acronyms, perhaps the easiest is a bad word, the best entry point for operationalizations of the SOGIESC inclusion. But I have to learn, we are at the beginning, and I think, as other panelists pointed out, even in our maturity, empowerment, and ability to engage with governments in difficult subjects, I have no absolute, and pretty optimistic that we're going to be able to talk about LBT, particularly the LMB women, very soon. But I think what you stated is absolutely correct. The letter T is a great entry point. My big ambition is to start to address the letter I. And once again, I think a concept that may transpire tonight is that we need to establish the trust of the client. And the reason why, Rachnaji, we're doing some of the pilots and grants at TA is to simply demonstrate the ability and willingness to seek the trust of the government, including yours, which is obviously a sophisticated, I may say, a client vis-a-vis the LGBTQI spectrum. It has been, for me, so far, a pleasure to work with the Ministry of Health and the India Council of Medical Research, an absolutely very opening learning experience because of the practicality. But we need to do more LB, I agree.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
And Mary, do you want to ask your question? And please introduce yourself if you can.
Yes, hello. My name is Mary Barrowman. I'm a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development on the Gender Equality and Inclusion team. And I've been doing some research recently, and we talked a lot here today about what's important in terms of being counted. And I would say in terms of research and policy engagement, it is really difficult to find historical like financing and programmatic data to really track this systematically, to think to understand how work of the MDBs has evolved. So I was just going to ask the panelists, how can this data be more transparently shared? And also, what mechanisms of accountability are possible for MDBs in terms of SOGIESC inclusion? I mean, point taken on client demand. Clifton, I know the IDB does set a target, but also for the World Bank, there's been so many exciting developments with SOGI inclusion, but the new corporate scorecard and gender strategy results frameworks really does not include any means to track this. So will this be tracked separately? And I guess how, as researchers and those who want to engage in the space, how can we access this type of data?
Who's a brave soul?
I'm happy to start, at least for the World Bank. And just to say, I think you're absolutely right. The challenge, the accountability is important. These are public institutions. I think the first level of accountability is the environmental and social framework, or for the various banks, the safeguards itself or themselves, because that's a place where one can look at what's required and what's actually being done or not done. And we have a long way to go on that, let me tell you. And that's an area that we've done a lot of digging in our own operations and through the portal, and trying to understand what's happening and what's not happening. And we have a snapshot of that just in the last number of months. It's not easy because our systems are not developed or not built to pull out this kind of information on any population or almost any population. And so it takes a lot of diligence, and it takes resources to go into those various operations and have somebody pulling out what they can derive from it about who got reached, and specifically if there were LGBTI people, for example, and an analysis of what kind of projects that happens in, maybe specific regions where it happens more often, et cetera. That's the kind of thing we're trying to do. It is not easy. And I have shared what we found so far through Outright Action International, or Outright International now, because as you know, they have a specific role to play in working with the MDBs. They've got a position there, somebody who focuses on the MDBs, Andrew Park. So we still have some way to go on that. And that really ties both the environmental and social framework obligations, but then more broadly, what is happening in operations or not happening. And then the other part of it is data. And this kind of also connects with the question that came in about LBT women. And when we look at research and generating data, we have a very specific focus on making sure we're defining that or disaggregating that by the different parts of the community so that we just don't have data on gay men and bi men, for example. And one thing we found that we can say, and this is not going to be a surprise for anybody here, is that in all of our research, the trend is the same. And that is that gay and bi men suffer from exclusion that can be measured in various aspects of development, again, health, education, social protection, whatever it might be, than do straight men, non-gay and bi men. Lesbian and bi women suffer worse than gay men, and the data tells us that. And the people who are most put upon of all, the people who are excluded most consistently, are trans people, and particularly trans women. And so this doesn't surprise us in this conversation, but it's important that we have that data to bring that in messaging about reform of policies and programs, as well as laws and regulations, to the governance, to the clients of the bank.
Simreen or Maria Amelia? Any?
Sure, happy to jump in. So yes, as Mary was mentioning, we have specific targets based on SOGIESC, depending on the issues at stake. So for example, for data collection and research, we have a target of establishing a standardized data collection mechanism to gather disaggregated data on SOGIESC issues in at least 10 countries. We have another target on inclusive service delivery, on community engagement, so specifically engage at least 50 LGBTIQ plus organizations in project design and implementation processes over the next 5 years. Capacity building is another one of these part of our overarching targets, awareness campaigns, as well as monitoring and evaluation framework, economic empowerment, mental health and well-being. So each of these has different SOGIESC targets that are measured specifically through both our Gender Diversity Inclusion Office mainstreaming efforts, as well as through social safeguards, as we were mentioning. And maybe something in addition that I would love to mention is that, for example, in one of the projects we had in a southern cone country, we not only focuses on the exclusion in this particular case of trans recyclers, trans women, trans female recyclers, but also in securing that they will have access to, for example, there's a cooperative that there's a recyclers cooperative that is already in place and that provides, for example, loans for recyclers in this particular city and country. And what we needed to do is make sure that once trans female recyclers are able to be part of the cooperative, is not just being part of the cooperative, is making sure that they will not be discriminated when they become part of the cooperative. And for example, what are some of the challenges they will face in accessing loans within that cooperative as trans female recyclers? Huge, right? Huge challenges. So making sure that in the design of the project and the mitigation plans, we have awareness campaigns and awareness training, skills development, so that they will be able to, let's say, flourish and thrive within this a social inclusion plan, as we call it.
Thank you. Maria Amelia, just a quick question because someone asked earlier. Are you doing any work in Guatemala?
In Guatemala, yes, we are doing some work in Guatemala, and I would be happy to share. So we have two divisions, as you saw in the framework on one of my slides. We have our strategy as the center, and then we have different ways in which we tackle these issues. So the Gender Diversity and Inclusion Office works on mainstreaming, and I understand that they are doing some important work in Guatemala. I'll be more than happy to share. As ESG, specifically social safeguards, I don't have a specific example in Guatemala now in terms of preventing discrimination, but I can definitely look at that, and more than happy to connect and share more information and collaborate, of course.
I'm going to throw it back to Clifton for 1 second on how because we need in 3 minutes, on how the World Bank is cooperating with the other MDBs, which was part of another earlier part.
Absolutely. You asked me that earlier and I didn't get to it, so I'm glad you brought it back. Just to say that at this point, you know, the World Bank, my position that I've been in for 8 years now, was the first position that had any kind of focus on SOGIESC. Since then, other development banks have brought in folks who are either leads or focal points on these issues, some of whom you're seeing here now. And so what we've done is we've organized ourselves in the last couple of years, and we meet regularly in a SOGIESC inclusion working group of the MDBs, including in person during the World Bank IMF spring meetings in DC last April. For the first time meeting in person. But we've decided that we're also going to have ongoing working groups under our overarching working group that will focus on some key issues for the MDBs to make sure we're not recreating the wheel among us, that we're sharing lessons learned, we're sharing things like trainings, for example, or capacity building materials and modules, how we do civil society consultation, all those kinds of things. So we want to share those among us. As a community of practice, if you will. And really the working groups that we're going to focus on and making sure that's happening, particularly are gender, also the gender equality agenda and how SOGIESC fits into that. Data, since we're all important knowledge banks, and so we're helping governments and others generate new data. The private sector, since all of these banks have loans that are related to the private sector, not just the public sector. For the World Bank, we have a whole arm of the bank, the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, that is private sector facing. The other banks have programs in this area. And then safeguards. You heard us talk about the ESF, the Environmental and Social Framework, the safeguard, the rules that come with the legal agreements of every loan, and the obligation, for example, of no discrimination in programs that enjoy these banks' financings. And so those are going to be the things we focus on for the really concentrate on lessons learned, exchanging lessons, and hopefully that helps us move this agenda more quickly through these development institutions. Back over to you.
Thank you, Clifton. So we'll end here. Thank you all. It's great to hear that this working group exists. Maybe this is a world that you may see yourself after, you know, whether you're already working in it or maybe you're doing your degree here. So thank you for sharing that. I'll echo again Mary's point about please make this data available to outsiders, academics that can analyze the impact in different ways. And that's an open discussion there. And we'll have, I'm sure in the third event, more talk about that. But thank you so much. And if you want to get connected with these folks, please send me an email or message on LinkedIn. Thank you so much. And see you all in the next event.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.